Mō tō mātanei kōrero, mō tō mātanei kaupapa, e pāriki hia, waini tātou. For the deliberations and for the discussions we will have amongst us, we ask thy blessings to be with us. Hāpai te mātou ki a taupai hukena e nei kei runga tō ara ki runga tō manakitanga. Embrace us to be able to deliver these kaupapa with thy guidance and their blessings that it may uplift us. No rea te matua whakapiri mai, whakatūwhera nei tēnei tō tātenei kaupapa tēnei wā, and we ask that they will open our proceedings together, kei runga hoki te ingoa tapu tō tātou kai whakora ake. Āmene. E tō tātenei wā atanei, te aroha. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e tātou e. Ka tira. May the blessings of our Creator guide and direct us this afternoon as we deliberate and lay before us important questions, important thinking about our journey, this wellness journey of ours this afternoon. Reira te matua whakapiri mai, ka tira e te iwi huri no tēnā koutou, tēnā hoki tātou anō. Ka huri nei.
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koe Ron, te kai karakia I tēnei rā. He mihi nui anō kia koe, nā I tōtoko mai I a tātou I tēnei rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ron. It's Jonathan Godfrey speaking. This afternoon's session is session 6 of 8, and I think every session is getting better and better as we all learn how well we can do this sort of forum. Just to remind you though, how the session will pan out. 3 parts. Part 1, highly scripted. We have prepared an opening statement and questions to put to government. They were shared, the questions, 3 weeks, nearly 4 weeks ago with government. The IMM has not seen the responses, and we are eagerly waiting, just like everyone else in the audience. We hope that while you are hearing answers coming through, that you will take the opportunity to pass comment on Slido, so that while we are deliberating in the offline section, part 2, we can incorporate the thinking of everyone who is joining us live at this time into the supplementary questions that get developed while we're on a bit of a break. We come back in the 3rd part for the last hour to put those supplementary questions to government. Just to remind you that while you're not speaking, if you could check that your microphones are muted. To remind you that everyone speaking on behalf of the IMM is a disabled person. Government responses will be led primarily by Rajesh Chana, who I will liaise with for who else we're expecting to hear from. And when each person from government does come to answer or to contribute to the discussion, if you could please state your name and the agency you are from, please. Can I remind everybody to speak clearly and not too fast? We don't need speeding tickets from the sign language interpreters, and hopefully we're doing a good job so far. You should be seeing live captions. You should be seeing a sign language interpretation. You should be seeing about 4 people at any given time on your screens. We won't be interfering with the answering of questions in part 1, but of course, if I need to, I'll ask a clarifying question. So without further ado, how about we get into that opening statement, and I call upon Rana Aston from Balance Aotearoa. If you'd join us, please now, Rana.
Tēnā koutou, ko Rana toko ingoa, ko Balance Aotearoa toko mahi. Thank you all for having me here today. It's a great honour indeed. Disabled people face widespread discrimination. As just one example, disability-related complaints to the Human Rights Commission are consistently in the 3 most grounds of complaints received. The many inequities disabled people face also reflect discrimination and cannot be attributed to chance. Disabled people die earlier, have twice the unemployment rate of non-disabled people, are more likely to report inadequate housing conditions, have insufficient money for basic necessities or healthcare, are overrepresented in the care and protection, youth justice, and corrections populations. Disabled people have been waiting decades for barriers that prevent them having equal access to resources and opportunities to be dismantled. This sends a signal that disabled people don't matter to government. It suggests that disabled people's rights of full participation are less important than perceived costs for government, business, or organisations. The law reflects social values and provides a key reference point for how we as a community think about disabled people. When the law discriminates by permitting people's rights to be limited because of a disability, it reflects a view that disabled people lack capacity, and it also reinforces that way of thinking. There are a range of laws such as the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act, as well as the Protection of Personal Property Right, as an example, through which disabled people lose the right to determine what happens to them. Compulsory treatment is disproportionately applied to tangata whaikaha Māori. Disabled people have told the IMM that loss of control undermines their value as equal citizen and it creates trauma. To quote just 2 people contributing to the IMM report, suppression of your will is not equal before law. Whole system impinges on your rights and your physical and mental integrity and cognitive liberty and your right to be who you are, unquote. The IMM agrees with Sir Robert Martin's description of Article 12, equality before the law, as the soul of the Disability Convention. The rights under this article enable many other rights. It is therefore very important that it is understood and implemented so that the legal framework protects disabled people's rights to make decisions about their own lives. The IMM would like to see education that ensures people developing and implementing law and policy really understand what Article 12 means and what is required. This article means people never lose their right to be involved in decisions about their lives. This article creates a duty for appropriate support to be provided when people need support to be involved in decisions about their lives. The legal framework needs to treat disabled people equally, including to ensure that disabled people can use the law and secure redress for legal or social inequities. Courts and complaints bodies must make appropriate procedural and reasonable accommodations to facilitate the access to justice. This is not universally the case at present. In spite of barriers, many disabled people succeed, are secure, and have positive hope for the future. But even when that is so, people are affected by many cumulative barriers and indignities. The IMM acknowledges there is work underway on legal reform, but there remains considerable work to uphold disabled people's mana and rights to be treated equally before the law, to be free from discrimination, and to be able to participate in and contribute to every aspect of community. Until then, we all lose.
Thank you, Rana. Just a reminder for everyone to be on mute if you're not speaking, please. We had a bit of background noise coming through my ears while Rana was speaking. Can I turn to the questions? And Rana, you've got the first question as well. So would you like to put that now, please?
Thank you, Jonathan. In its initial written response to the IMM, the Ministry of Justice rejected the IMM's recommendation for amending the Human Rights Act, which to remove disability-related exemptions and amend the definition of reasonable accommodation. The Ministry has indicated that it instead prioritises amending the Human Rights Act with regard to incitement to hatred. A, what was the rationale for rejecting the disabled persons-led recommendation of the IMM? How are disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori involved in that decision making? Thank you.
Jonathan speaking again. I'll turn to Rajesh Chana, who's the lead for this session for government. Rajesh?
Thank you, Jonathan. Tēnā koutou. Rajesh Chana Tokuinga. My role here with the Ministry of Justice is that I'm the Deputy Secretary of Policy. So before I just answer get to the question, I thought I'd just quickly outline how we'll approach today. So while I am the lead, I have a number of colleagues here from the ministry, but also from other departments, and I'll be referring questions to them as we go through. So hopefully it's a bit of an orderly fashion as we answer the questions. So I'll turn now to the first question. So first, I'd just like to say that the ministry and the government has not rejected any of the recommendations that were made by the IM in relation to reasonable accommodation. What the issue was at the time is that we have a number of priorities that we're working on at any given time, and we're asked to prioritise those depending on what the issues that the government of the day would like to deal with. So overall, while we do consider that the Human Rights Act is consistent with the convention, we also acknowledge that there's also always room for improvement, and always there are a range of developments underway internationally and domestically. That means we need to keep cognizant of those and take those into account and have a look at what does that mean for our framework. But at after the election, there were a number of other things also on the table that the government needed to have a look at, and they asked us in particular to focus on the incitement of hatred work. And as people were aware, that came out of a recommendation of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the terrorist attack on the Christchurch Masjid, and that was released in December 2020. So that was a key thing that the government asked us to accelerate and bring forward, which we have done, and people would be aware of the consultation that occurred around that, and we're currently considering all of those submissions and working our way through it. Also at the same time, following the election, the government had made a commitment regarding the banning of conversion practices, so that was also a further piece of work in the human rights space that we took on. That also had a substantial amount of work, and we had the record-breaking number of submissions on that to Select Committee at over 100,000, so that was also a significant amount of work for us. So again, just to reiterate, there was no rejection of any of the recommendations, it's a question of what we're able to work on at any given time, and those are two particular areas that we're in competition with these particular recommendations. So
Rajesh, the question presupposes that it has been rejected, and if it hasn't been rejected, then when will it be addressed?
I cannot give you a definitive answer as to that. Our work program is very dynamic and wide-ranging. We're still continuing our work on the incitement or hate speech provisions, and it's just a question of talking to the Minister and the Cabinet about what comes next. And at this stage, I can't give any definitive answer as to when we might get to these issues.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. Sorry, were you on your own for answering that question, or is there someone else?
Oh, that's the answer.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get into a rhythm soon enough. The next question is to be delivered by Prudence Walker from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Prudence, please.
Dr. Jonathan. Question 2 is, please outline how the CRPD Committee's General Comment number 6 on equality and non-discrimination were taken into account when rejecting the IMM's recommendation and concluding that the current Human Rights Act is inadequate for disabled people. And supplementary to that is, if General Comment 6 was not taken into account, what urgent action will the Ministry take within the next 3 months to consider an updated definition of reasonable accommodation and to evaluate the fairness of disability expectations currently in the Act?
Rajesh, turning to you in the first instance.
Thank you. It's Rajesh Chana again. I think I can only pretty much reiterate again the answer that I gave to the first question, is that it hasn't been rejected at all, and we need to get to that and work on it. So really, as I've said in answer to the previous question, we will be doing that, and there's always room for improvement. It's just a question of our priorities and being able to work on things.
It's Jonathan again. So for clarification, are you saying that it is on the agenda somewhere?
I mean, if I just to sort of provide you with some context, for the Ministry of Justice, we administer over 150 separate statutes, over 52 different regulatory regimes, and while the human rights regimes are a core part of our work, and we are the domestic lead on 4 out of the 7 core human rights conventions that New Zealand has acceded to, that brings its challenges in being able to deal with things at the same time. So right now, as I said in your previous clarifying question, is that we're always looking at opportunities to improve things, but it's a question of finding the right time to be able to do that alongside all the many other things that we're doing.
So for clarification purposes, is there a place where disabled people and the IMM could go to see when these things will rise to the top of the list?
I mean, that's probably not a simple question, a simple answer to that, in that we don't have a simple statement of what anything is that we're working on at a particular time. It's guided a lot by what the government priorities are, and some of those you'd find in things like the speech from the throne or the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament. There's a number of broad-ranging things like that which set out the priorities, and again, some of the commitments we make through the to the UN through the human rights reporting mechanisms. They also have an outline there of what we might be working on at any given time. So there isn't a simple place. Part of it is, though, we're open to having just regular engagements and keeping in touch with the IMM regarding what our current priorities are at any given time.
Okay, and I'm just assuming you're the only person responding on that question too.
Yes, I suppose just for a matter of ease, unless I refer to someone else, I think you can just take it that that's me.
Okay. So we'll move to the next question then. And if I was worried about my responsibilities to keep us on track for getting through, I should calm down, I suspect. We're moving to Nathan Bond from the Disabled Persons Assembly for the 3rd question, please, Nathan.
Kia ora, Jonathan. Question 3. The Ministry of Justice has indicated their assessment that New Zealand law is compliant with the CRPD. This contradicts the views of a range of human rights experts about what is required for compliance with Article 12 of the Disability Convention. equality before the law. How has the Ministry used recent guidance from human rights experts, such as the CRPD Committee General Comments 1, Equality before the Law, and 6, Equality and Non-Discrimination, to assess that the legislative framework remains compliant, up to date, and fit for purpose, and to plan for progressive advancement of rights under Article 12. There's 4 subparts to that. A, if the above guidance has been used and alternative positions reached, what countervailing analysis or evidence was used to inform alternative interpretations of the obligations required to uphold Articles 5, Equality, Non-Discrimination, and 12, Equality before the law. B, how will this be explained to the CRPD committee when New Zealand is reviewed in August 2022? C, if the Ministry has not used this guidance to date, what urgent actions will be taken to ensure the guidance will be used to inform the repeal of the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act? D, how will the Ministry use this guidance when considering the recommendations of the Law Commission on adult decision-making capacity legislation? Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Rajesh, do you want to take those subparts in order, or I'll leave it to you to work out?
Yeah, I think apologies, Rajesh Chana here again. So I'll try to work our way through it. I think I might have been some transliteration of the questions, and I think I just need to kind of make sense of it in terms of my notes. I thought some of the subparts related to a previous question as well, so we'll just sort of gently try and work our way through it so it makes sense. In terms of the core part of the question, I might just invite my colleague Ursula Kirpin to introduce herself and take you through that, and then she'll hand back to me and I'll guide us through the rest of the questions. So Ursula, please.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Ursula tuku ingoa. I am Ursula Kirpin from the Ministry of Justice. So I will be responding to A and B of question 3. An audit of New Zealand regulatory systems was conducted prior to the ratification of the convention, and existing legislation was amended to bring it into alignment with the convention. Any new policy and legislative proposals must be assessed against the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act and the Human Rights Act, which specifically include the right to be free from discrimination because of disability. Advice on such proposals should also address their consistency with the New Zealand international human rights obligations where relevant, in order to ensure that we remain compliant. All agencies are expected to use the relevant guidance in general comments when working on policies and legislation, as they are considered authoritative interpretations of the obligations under a convention. And the Ministry of Justice supports other agencies with general domestic and international human rights policy input. The Ministry of Justice will consider the implications of the Disability Convention in detail when any relevant piece of justice legislation is under review, or when a specific instance of a potential inconsistency is being raised. The Ministry of Justice will refer to core human rights treaties, including the Disability Convention, where appropriate in future legislation. An example where New Zealand legislation expressly refers to the rights under the Disability Convention is Section 5 of the Oranga Tamariki Act 1989. The Ministry of Justice has not undertaken a full assessment of all legislation against the Disability Convention since the initial audit was undertaken, as we are not the lead agency for this convention. However, the 2014 to 2018 Disability Action Plan included an action to undertake a stocktake to identify any legislation that is not consistent with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and to explore options to improve consistency. This work was led by the Office for Disability Issues. Kia ora, and back to Rajesh, please.
Thank you, Ursula. Rajesh here again. I think the next question is then related to...
Sorry, Jonathan, here, just before you go on, did ODI want to respond to that last contribution?
Thank you, Jonathan. Brian speaking from the Office for Disability Issues. So a part of that work was progressed in developing a list with the DPO Coalition on the legislation that was kind of ordered the legislation that is most at risk of being inconsistent with the UNCRPD. The next bit is to do a detailed audit of that legislation.
Right. So we go back to you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Rajesh speaking. Now, I understand that the next question related to the Mental Health Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act components. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I think it might be simplest then if I refer to colleagues from the Ministry of Health to introduce themselves and address the question.
Tēnā katoa. My name is John Crawshaw. I am the Director of Mental Health and Addiction within the Ministry of Health, and I will take the question on the Mental Health Act as well as the question on the Substance Addiction Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act. And if we want to go into the IDC, CNR Act, I'll pass to my colleague Amanda Smith.
When you do, you might need to unpack those acronyms for us.
Okay, sorry, I will do that for you.
Thank you.
My apologies. In relation to the Mental Health Act, Hiara Oranga, the report of the government inquiry into the mental health and addiction, noted that the current Mental Health Act is out of date, inconsistent with Aotearoa New Zealand's obligations under international law, and can result in trauma and harm to people receiving compulsory treatment. As part of its response, the government agreed to the recommendation in Hiara Oranga to repeal and replace the Mental Health Act. The recommendation in Hiara Oranga gives us a starting point for a vision of future mental health legislation. It flags that at a minimum, legislation needs to reflect a human rights-based and recovery approach to care, promote supportive decision-making, and minimise compulsory care and coercion. Consistent with this, the repeal and replacement of the current Mental Health Act provides an opportunity to create new legislation which has a greater consistency with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It must also recognise Te Tiriti and support the rights of Māori as tangata whenua, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We note that the current Mental Health Act states that a person cannot be subjected to a compulsory assessment and treatment process solely because they have an intellectual disability. However, it is possible for a person to have an intellectual disability and a mental health condition, in which case, if the person has a mental disorder as defined by the current Mental Health Act, then compulsory assessment and treatment may be used. That said, ensuring that disabled people have equitable outcomes under new legislation will be critical to achieving the vision for mental health legislation Hiara Oranga outlined. We recently undertook a 3-month public consultation process to begin a dialogue with the public on what they would like the future of mental health legislation to look like. This covered key areas such as whether legislation should ever allow compulsory treatment, if treatment is permitted, the role of decision-making capacity, and how we can ensure people are supported to make decisions about their own treatment and care. What, if any, specific requirements should legislation include regarding disabled people, whether seclusion or restricted practices should ever be allowed. The feedback from the public consultation will guide the development of the new legislation. All feedback is currently being analysed by an independent provider. We had high levels of engagement, and it is encouraging to see that New Zealanders are ready to see significant changes and different approaches to the new mental health legislation. In relation to the Substance Addiction Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act, sometimes called SACAT, it is important to note that the Act only enables people to receive compulsory assessment and treatment if they have a severe substance addiction and their capacity to make decisions about treatment for that addiction is severely impaired. It is intended as a last resort if all other treatment options have not been successful. The Act requires that its operation and effectiveness is to be reviewed after the first 3 years of operation. An independent review commissioned by the Ministry of Health found that the Act is performing well in achieving its purposes in relation to the protection from harm, assessment of addiction, and stabilising of health. We are pleased to see that the checks and balances in support of appropriate use of powers and protection of human rights are central to the delivery of the Substance Addiction Act. However, and I have to preface these comments because the review has yet to be tabled in Parliament. We also acknowledge that there's room for to improve the systems and the services that support the Act. In particular, our understanding is that the needs of people with disability, particularly those with learning disabilities, needs to be better considered in the context of this legislation. Disabled people, particularly those with moderate intellectual impairment, may be less likely to access the substance abuse services they may be eligible for. It is therefore possible that disabled people are underrepresented in those accessing the Substance Addiction Act. The wider work underway to transform the mental health and addiction system has a strong focus on achieving equity, including for disabled people, and seeks to ensure people who need mental health and addiction services are able to access them. Do we want to move on to the diverting people out of the justice sector question? If so, I'll pass across to my colleague, Dr. Amanda Smith.
I think we're staying within the confines of the primary question at this stage.
I'll leave Rashi's to direct traffic.
Yes, please. Rajesh, we're looking to you.
That's okay, thank you, John. So if I've keeping track of the question then, I think there was just a reference then to substituted decision-making in the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act of 1988. So I might just make some brief comments here, and there's some further questions there which we can get into some further discussion. Is that where we're up to? Or?
Jonathan speaking. Part D of the primary question is yet to be addressed, if it's any help. How will the Ministry use this guidance when considering the recommendations of the Law Commission, that one, on adult decision-making capacity legislation?
Oh, okay, my apologies, I'm kind of...
Excuse me, Ursula, yeah, that's question 4 in our list, Rajesh.
Oh, I see, okay, that's my apologies. I think the list of questions we've got provided is slightly...
The bullet points are out?
Different in terms of where they've landed, so hence my confusion here. Okay, so if we're now, I can address that. If we were now talking about how we will consider the recommendations of the Law Commission, so I might just, no, sorry, apologies, I'm just going to be darting backwards and forwards on a couple of different pages as I'll piece this together. So with the Law Commission, they're doing a review of the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act 1988, and as the title suggests, that it's now over 30 years old, and it is somewhat dated, and quite obviously society has shifted on quite a lot since the time that legislation was passed. Consequently, that is why the government referred the review of the legislation to the Law Commission to have a look at in depth. I just note in the context of sort of going through this answer in more detail, while the Act provides for substituted decision making, the Act still encourages people to act on behalf of other people, to involve those people in decisions. So for example, the Act states that welfare guardians, property managers and enduring powers of attorney shall encourage the subject person to act on his or her own behalf to the greatest extent possible and seek to facilitate their integration into the community as much as possible. So that was the words from 1988. So that doesn't go as far as what current thinking would suggest. So that brings us to acknowledging that the Act is dated, and that's why it was referred to the Law Commission. So the Law Commission, as people would know, is the independent Crown entity, has its own legislation, is independent and is tasked with reviewing legislation. They take a very robust approach to any of the reviews they undertake. So in this case, they've developed a terms of reference, and I've been advised that those terms of reference were developed, will involve consultation with the independent monitoring mechanism. And they did that late last year, and the terms of reference were published in October 2021, and they're available on the Law Commission's website. The Law Commission's approach will involve public consultation, and that'll be done later this year. They'll typically introduce an issues paper, and then following that, they'll consider those submissions, and then if they follow their standard process, they'll release a set of proposals for further consultation. And at this stage, that's planned for 2023. And they'll look to involve a range of key stakeholders throughout that process as well. And again, they'll be in communication directly regarding how they'll carry that out, including engaging with all the people represented on this call. So where you get to after all that is that the Law Commission will report to the Minister probably in the 2023-24 financial year, and that'll come through the Minister to us in order to assist with the government response. And then how do you take the recommendations forward if those are accepted by the government? So if I go back to the question there is about, well, how would we use this guidance when considering the recommendations of the Law Commission? At one level, the expectation and hope is that all of that guidance and all of the thinking that's currently out there will be picked up and incorporated into the Law Commission's process, and we'll see that reflected in the final report that they produce. So it would be an inherent part of their process to make sure that what's presented to government is, in essence, and what they usually try and do is provide a set of recommendations which gives you a coherent way forward in terms of what would the schema of a new act potentially look like, which gives the government something to pick up and run with if that's what the government would like to do. So looking at previous considerations, that's largely what they do. So when we're considering it, we're also work with the Law Commission when we're providing that advice to government too. So a long way of saying that we'd expect all that guidance to have been incorporated into that final report. So for us, it would be just really checking on that and then providing that advice to the government using that material as well.
Okay, thank you. I got
on that one.
Jonathan speaking again. I think you got there in the end, tackling the primary question. I'm going to suggest we move on to the next question 4, because I suspect we're starting to overlap a little. And I'm going to call upon Prudence Walker from Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand to give us that question, please. Prudence.
Kia ora, Jonathan. Thank you for that. Following on from the previous questions, pending the results of the Law Commission work on adult decision making, what is the Ministry doing currently to give stronger legal guarantees of the right of disabled people to make decisions, to access the right support to make decisions, and to provide stronger legal protections for decisions made with support?
Go ahead, Rajesh.
Okay. Sorry again for my confusion by just speaking again. I've got that as question 5 on my copy I was provided. Is that, there was no.
Let's go with the words and not worry about the numbering. Shall
Okay,
we?
right, all right. We can do that. I'm just making sure we're trying to keep track. So, for the purpose of clarity, I will be solely responding to this question. Just bear with me a moment while I just refer to my correct notes. There we are. Oh, scrolling. Apologies. Okay, here we are. So in relation to this question, so you've asked how would we give stronger legal guarantees? What I would say, just to preface my response into this, is that in terms of stronger legal guarantees, that is predicated on us being able to change the statutory framework. And really, that's not possible until we've had a chance to review the Law Commission's, the government has a chance to look at the Law Commission's recommendations and enact legislative change. So in the meantime, what we are able to do is continue to do what we currently do, is in terms of providing support as people go through the process mandated under the current Act through the court process, which would include things like communications assistance and the general other services, which will, I think, come to under some of the later questions about assisting people through the court process. And if we look at the wider system, we have bodies like the New Zealand Law Society continuing to do things like continuing legal education in terms that, so that practitioners who work in this area are up to date with the latest case law and thinking in this space. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that review to conclude and before we can move through to legislative reform, it's just about focusing on delivering the services that we have now rather than being able to provide any stronger legal protections.
Which means we turn to the next question. It's going to be put by Nathan Bond from DPA NZ. Go ahead, Nathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Question 5. Well, 5 on my sheet. I don't know about yours. What plans does the ministry have to ensure disabled people lead initiatives to improve access to justice? And in the first instance, the development, teaching, implementation, oversight, and monitoring of supported decision-making frameworks. A, what plans does the ministry have to ensure that disabled people's leadership in such initiatives is sustainably resourced and funded? Thank you.
Go ahead, Rajesh.
Thank you. Right. Again. Right. Apologies. So again, it'll just be me responding to this question. Rajesh speaking through the duration of it. In the context of access to justice is a very broad area. So what I might do in responding to this question is break it down and just refer to a couple of areas of work as a way of illustrating some of the issues. So access to justice across the broad justice system, if I look at it, there's the civil justice, which I think someone's already referred to in terms of what you might find in the family court or other dispute resolution, the criminal justice system, where you go for if you're charged with victims of or of responding to criminal charges. And then we've also got broader things in terms of family court. What I might do first, just to outline an area of work we're currently doing. Access to justice in the civil space has always been a somewhat challenging area to get to because it is so broad and wide-ranging. What we currently have in place is some work that we are doing in conjunction with the judiciary and the legal profession, which is known as wayfinding for justice. And that's being led by an independent advisory group supported by the ministry, but largely led by experts and practitioners in the area. And they've just started their work and they've released a current process where they're going to start gathering broader contributions to that. And so this work is not something that's sort of supposed to be a quick fire piece. It's about ranging over a number of months and years to kind of really understand what the legal needs of people are and find ways to responding to do that. So that's a new way for us of approaching these issues, rather than trying to pick off particular subject matter areas or particular issues at a time, and then provide point-by-point solutions. So this broad approach is something new for us, and it's also a way that we're working with a lot of interested people in the area, and that's just starting out. Part of that then is exploring how we bring on board the variety of groups that are affected by the justice system or need access to justice, and that very much includes the disability community. So not much more to say on that at this stage, but that's something I think we're very much wanting to keep you as the independent monitoring mechanism up to date with, and also looking at ways we can encourage that group to engage and address the issues about access to justice for the disabled community. A second related part of that, which supports that work, and it's something that we've not done in a very long time, which is a comprehensive legal needs survey. So the last one of that was really done in 2005, and we haven't been able to get to it with other things on the plate, but we are now looking to run a comprehensive survey which tries to identify what is all the unmet legal need that is present, and do that in a comprehensive way. We're currently only at the early design stages of that in terms of formulating what the survey questions might need to entail, but again that's another development for us in looking at that wider access to justice picture on the civil side of the equation. And the third leg I just comment on in relation to access to justice is around the legal aid system. That was last had a review in 2018, and a lot of that identified the core issues there is about eligibility, about who is eligible for civil legal aid to help people through it. At the moment, you really do need to not have pretty much any income or any assets to be eligible. So that's something that we're continuing to work on with government, and that's something that's progressed through budget processes. And given the nature of budget processes, not much more I can say, but there are proposals under consideration which may be announced in budget when the budget's read in May this year. So there's a range of things in there that could be improved, and we're continuing to work on those in the civil justice area. So those are some of the areas there. In terms of involvement around disabled people through those processes, as I've indicated, we're at the early stages of taking that work forward in something of a different way for us. And consequently, that's kind of a work in progress. A couple of other areas, I suppose, that are just worth touching on, which you would have heard about in earlier sessions. So in the family violence, sexual violence space, or the national strategy, Te Ao Rere Kura, and the action plan that's associated with, I think Victoria Manning from the Joint Venture Business Unit spoke to some of the work that's being done there, but there is a piece there which they are looking at developing, and that involves engagement and working with disabled communities through there. So that's kind of one aspect of access to justice in that particular area. The last piece I might just touch on in that context as well. I'll just touch on it very briefly. It's just really the wider public sector work with Papa Pounamu and the Disability Network, and just building relationships, and how does that underpin a lot of our work, and the internal work in terms of staff capability and training and awareness. So I might just leave it at that in terms of just a broad outline of some of the things that we're starting to do in that space.
Lovely. So for clarity's sake, you are making a commitment that the Ministry of Justice will be involving disabled people in those projects?
Yes, so we're at the early stages, and we're working our way through that and looking at how involvement can happen.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Moving to the next question, it's still with Nathan Bond. Nathan.
Question 6. What initiatives does the government have planned to specifically address the overrepresentation of disabled people in the justice/youth justice system? Thank you.
Back to you, Rajesh.
Thank you. I'll start with some brief overview comments and a couple of referring to a couple of initiatives, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Claudia Boyles from Oranga Tamariki to speak to aspects of the question as well. So in terms of the first part, in terms of just generally about overrepresentation in both aspects of youth and the general population, a lot of the ministry's work centres around what happens when you are arrested and then come to court and then the case is being disposed of. And just not to dwell too much on the history of things, but over the years we've had a range of specialist courts or new ways of approaching things developing through how cases are heard. The youth court itself can be described as a specialist court as a way to take account of the specific needs of young people. And over time, there's been a range of other initiatives taken, which would be around the young adults court, special circumstances courts, the alcohol and drug court, all of which are trying to move beyond simply dealing with cases, which is what you would have seen in the 1780s before the advent of more specialist courts, through to actually focusing more on the individual that appears before the court and how do you actually address the issues that they face rather than just simply focusing on disposing of the case. So over the years, we've had a range of initiatives, and some of these would be judicially led because the courtroom is their domain, and that is how those things are operated, and it's about respecting the respective roles of the executive and the judiciary. So in that vein, what's being done just recently, and it's an initiative led by the Chief District Court Judge, Judge Hemi Taumanu, which is entitled Te Ao Marama. And part of that is about bringing together all of those separate and disparate, things that have been done to improve the experience of people in court. And the overarching goal of Te Ao Marama is to not have specialist courts, but to incorporate all of those good practices into dealing with cases just generally. So we're not going to have specialist courts. You'd end up having just with the district court in particular, which is the court that deals with most of the business that comes to the court, in a way that is solutions focused. So the large part of that is solutions focused judging, and a lot of that then involves just saying, well, what do we need to do to assist the person that's appearing before the court or participating in a court hearing? So that could be simply about assistance with being able to be well represented or participate in the hearing itself, but it's also about bringing the community together to say, what else does there need to be in terms of providing services to that person where they might be needed to assist them with things in their life, or whether that's to help them through the process that they're going through, or anything that they need. And that's also then working closely with other agencies like health, like education, like housing, to be able to have those services available, and also looking more broadly at the community, and in particular also looking at iwi hapu involvement about how to support people that are coming through courts, and then also more broadly, it's more of a general thing, it's about infusing tikanga and te reo Māori into the proceedings as well. So that's kind of the overarching piece there in terms of being able to provide what happens more generally in that courts space and the changing approach in that area. If anyone wants to follow up, I can provide some more particular detail around that. But I think at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Claudia to talk a bit more about youth justice aspects of the question.
Yeah, so it's Claudia Boyles here from Oranga Tamariki. As Rajesh just mentioned, we're working together with the Ministry of Justice to have communications assistants and speech language therapists available to assist rangatahi and whānau in understanding and participating in court and family group conferences. So not just in court, but in GCs as well. The court can appoint, or the family group conference coordinator can arrange for a communications assistance where their support might benefit rangatahi in understanding and participating in the court and the family group process. We have a process that's used when considering whether a child or young person or their whānau could benefit from communication assistance. so that they can fully participate in a youth justice conference. We're also working with Talking Trouble Aotearoa to develop a standardized approach, engaging a communications assistance. The separate program is embedding Whakataka Pokai as a model of care. So it's a Māori-informed youth justice centre that provides care and support for up to 15 young people remanded or sentenced by youth court or adult courts. Whakataka Pokai provides safe, therapeutic and secure accommodation for young men who are assessed as having unique or complex needs, and young women who are assessed as having less specialised needs. It was designed and created in partnership with Mana Whenua and Tangata Whenua, and it's within the Tainui Confederation of Tribes Rohe. Tainui have a 1,000-year-old relationship with the Whenua and obligations to safeguard and protect the land and its natural resources. So Whakataka Pokai is nurtured and enhanced by Waikato, Tikanga and Kawa, and that lays the foundation on which the residents operate. It's been designed as a Māori-based service, and it has several unique aspects, including services to support rangatahi and whānau that reflect kaupapa and tikanga that underpin that program, including a welcome into the residents, additional support for whānau engagement, education and health services incorporating Mātauranga Māori and concepts of hauora, tikanga, kawa, whakapapa and Māori ora. There's a tangata whenua committee, kaumatua and kuia support, all aspects of operation of the strategic planning and community engagement. And they've employed specialist positions, for example, rangatahi mentors who work directly with rangatahi. The model of care is subject to external evaluation based on our Māori framework, and it's guided by Mātauranga Māori tikanga protocols and practices. The evaluation is going to assess wellbeing outcomes for rangatahi, their pathways to assistance, and outcomes for whānau. The evaluation will also assess the difference between Whakataka Pokai is making for rangatahi, whānau, mana whenua, and tangata whenua partners, and kaimahi supporting the rangatahi. A draft evaluation framework is going to be presented to the residents management this year in March, April, very soon. And the evaluation is also scheduled to be completed in late 2023. We also have a neurodiversity program enabling Te Akaroa, and it's a kahunga iwi response to neurodiversity. So that neurodiversity program involves the partnered design of end-to-end pathway for rangatahi and whānau involved with youth justice. The project aims to address the neurodiverse and cultural needs of rangatahi, whānau and victims of offending. The pathway design will take a community-led approach, and our partners include Te Ikaroa Rangatahi Iwi Social Services, Ngāi Tahi Kuhungu Iwi, Justice, Police, Education and Health. We're in the design phase right now, and we'll trial and evaluate the pathway by the end of 2022. So all of these things are related to the shift that's happening in Oranga Tamariki around practice. It's a substantial shift, and the new practice frameworks for social work practice is framed in Te Tiriti, and it draws on the Te Ao Māori principles of Oranga. It's a rights-based, and inclusive of a social model of disability, and specific actions are aimed at improving outcomes for tangata whaihaha, including incorporating the social and rights-based model of disability into the description of Oranga, developing disability-specific practice guidance, including guidance of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and neurodisability for social workers and other practitioners, engaging with parents of tamariki with FASD, and drawing on resources co-designed with tangata whaikaha. And we've also got a separate program running alongside called Tahapai O, which is about lifting cultural capabilities among staff. So I guess what I really want to say about some of these programs are happening in the youth justice system, but they're aimed at recidivism and aimed at in keeping children out of the justice system later on in their lives.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to look at the clock and suggest we move on to the next question, which is to be put by Rana Aston from Balance Aotearoa. Rana.
Kia ora, Rana here. The IMM is pleased to see dedicated disability training in the justice sector. The training is described as awareness training. The CRPD requires both awareness and rights-based training. Before suggesting such training is upscaled, we would like to know, A, how have tangata whaikaha Māori and disabled people been involved in the development and delivery of the disability training model in the justice sector? B, how are disabled people's rights, particularly 12 of CRPD equity before the law, which is often described as the heart of the systemic shift needed to realise the convention, explicitly woven throughout the training? C, what mechanisms does the ministry have to support training transfer into practice, and how is the impact of the training being evaluated, and when will that evaluation be released? D, how will the government ensure disabled people lead future training on disability rights across the justice sector?
Thanks, Rana. Serious feedback seems to have gone. Rajesh.
Thank you. Rajesh speaking again. I will address some comments to this question to start with, and then I'll then hand over to my colleague from the Ministry of Social Development and Advoca to speak more broadly about some training and some lead toolkit work that Social Development is coordinating. I think to start with, I'd just like to probably note that I suspect this is referring to a response we gave in the earlier questionnaire, and the training referred to as not so grand as to be justice sector training. What we were referring to in that comment was some training that we have developed internally for the Ministry of Justice, and it is awareness training, and it's about awareness training in the workplace targeted to our people leaders, so all of the managers in the Ministry of Justice. It's an online training module which we've put in place as part of a program of work that we do for our managers to make sure that they can, well, it's sort of the initial phase as part of their training as managers and people leaders to make sure that they're fully aware of the different needs of people that they might need to look after, and also help them understand other aspects of the work through recruitment and other things as well. So it is not a very broad-ranging piece of work, and it is more focused simply on our people leaders. So just to clarify that, so consequently we do not have a large breadth of work around evaluating that or any such thing as that. It's not that type of program that you were across the justice sector. Very briefly, before I hand over to Anne, though, I just sort of touch on some other things that we've got in place in terms of training, and a lot of that then sort of revolves around particular tasks and services that are provided as well. So there are training modules available, for example, for all the communications assistants that we have available, and also that sits under the communications assistance quality framework. So that is a resource that we have to make sure that people continue to keep up with best practice and are trained in a consistent way. And then similarly, we've got the recent passage of legislation for bailiffs, which was about seizing property and other things like that. So we're always making sure that people are up to date with what the obligations and responsibilities are in that context as well. We also do things like support the New Zealand Law Society when they deliver training as well to practitioners in terms of neurodiversity, disability and alternative communication needs and things like that too. So there's a range of things that go on through that area. And we've also got things that other agencies do in terms of Department of Corrections and New Zealand Police as core justice sector agencies about how to approach things I know that we have colleagues available here from the Department of Correction, so I might invite them if they've got anything to add to that after we've heard from Anne from Ministry of Social Development. So at this point, I'll hand over to Anne. If you could introduce yourself and take us from there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Anne Walker. I'm the Principal Disability Advisor at the Ministry of Social Development. One of the things that was recognised in building a disability inclusive workplace within the public service were what we call the 3 A's. And that was having a reasonable accommodation policy and guidelines throughout the public service, having a public service that's accessible, both in terms of its buildings, its information, and the way in which it treats its employees and people who use the service. And last but by no means least is a disability awareness, what I prefer to call disability responsiveness, although to keep it as a 3A, we use the word awareness. And one of the things we recognised is we need to have a consistent approach across the public service. And we did know and work with the people who helped develop the Justice Disability Awareness. We're working with people from Corrections, from Statistics New Zealand, from ACC, and from Orangatamariki, and others are welcome to join. All of the people within the public service, or the majority of the people in the public service that we are working with, are disabled people themselves. However, we recognise the importance of having the voice of disabled people's organisations, and we presented, gave a short presentation last Friday to the DPOs around this proposed training and asked for 2 representatives to be part of the development of the training. The training, it is expected, would be included in anyone's induction, but we recognise there's already people in the system who have various values and that ableist thinking. So we wanted to make sure everyone at one point got the training. The second thing that is important is it is a very much based on a rights-based and treaty. So woving those various aspects together to ensure that we do support and acknowledge the UN CRPD is the founding document for disabled people and the founding document for New Zealand being treaty, and also acknowledging the contribution that disabled people make. It will be an online module or a series of 5 online modules that will be very much initial package, plus it would be expected because everyone does a refresher every year. It will have, while there will be short modules, there'll also be access to resources and a kit of resources that are already existing in terms of the lead toolkit, but we will work with the DPOs to make sure, for example, the information we have on language is up to date, the same with disability etiquette. So we also want to have the modules that build on each other, and that there's a call to action, particularly around what you have heard impacts. So calling out some of the myths around disabled people. Also, the way in which deficit language can very much impact on and how we as within the public service need to be careful of both our language and the way in which we unconsciously often display ableist approaches. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just wondering.
I'm going to suggest that we've got time for possibly one more question of the 2, and we're going to have to make a plan for the last one anyway.
Why don't I just stop talking and hand back to you, Jonathan?
Unless there's someone desperate to contribute to that 7th question.
No,
3, 2, 1, gone. Nathan Bond is going to, it's a quick question. Nathan, go ahead, please.
Access to justice relies on access to information. What is the ministry's approach to accommodating disabled people's information needs? Thank you.
Raj.
Thank you, Roger, speaking again. A short question, but could involve a long answer, but I'll endeavour to kind of keep this shorter than my notes would offer. So our starting point is under the Disability Action Plan is on improving justice services so they are accessible and able to be understood by disabled people. And really we've got a broad range of services that we provide, and it's not really a case of one size fits all. And so it's really about making sure that we do meet the needs of the person that's appearing or engaging in the areas that we are responsible for. So part of that is in terms of at the basic level, we've signed up to the Web Accessibility Standards for the New Zealand government and making sure that any of our content is accessible as possible. And it's also making sure that we provide good information to any participant through a court process that meets their needs so that they understand and have the necessary information in a format that works for them as well. And that goes across the whole wider justice sector. What I just quickly touch on is also we've got a large policy role, obviously, in the Ministry of Justice. And in terms of that space, we are looking to make sure that we are providing accessible versions on all of the significant policy work that we've currently got underway. And we're looking at and trying to make sure we have good access to whether that's sign language translations, audio versions, e-read and large print formats, braille formats and easy read versions. For us, I mean, I think where that all came to the fore is that the ministry was responsible for the information campaigns for the 2 referendums that were held with the last election. And that was a significant undertaking for us and also posed a number of challenges in that for those areas, and it also goes for a number of other areas where we provide information, we do need to be very balanced, impartial, not trying to take one side or another, and that does pose challenges for us in some contexts. It's pretty straightforward when if it's translating to sign language or large format or braille where you're just providing a straightforward translation. But where it comes to things like easy read, I recall looking at the information we're providing on the cannabis referendum, and the suggestion from the experts was that someone in a medical professional looking cartoon character standing in front of a cannabis leaf with 2 thumbs up would be a good way to characterize the what was trying to be communicated. But then when you step back and think about it, that's not very impartial in some respects as well. So we really are quite conscious of this now after that quite pointed experience for us, and we're bringing that experience to bear through all of the communications that we're now developing. So just I thought maybe something to lighten the moment in terms of trying to illustrate how we're taking that forward. And then there's a range of things we're also looking at in the family justice area, particularly in the care of children space, in terms of making sure some of the information in that space is available for a wide range, because families and young people and a lot of people are involved in that space, and that's something we're following up through an independent panel report that was conducted some years ago now, but we're now moving through to delivering on some of those things as well. So a range of audiences and contexts that we need to provide information for, but really we're trying to do as much as we can and learning from our experiences to make sure that we can be providing information in a way that really works for people. Thank you.
I'm looking at the clock and knowing we've got a 9th question and 3 minutes to do it in. Prudence, perhaps if you read the primary question and leave the 2 subparts, we'll get the addressing the main question in that time. So Prudence Walker from DPA, please.
Jonathan. How were people who require communication assistance involved in the development of the quality assurance framework for communications assistance?
Kia ora koutou, ko Deborah Mills toko ingoa. I'm a principal advisor in the Ministry of Justice, and I'll be answering this question. In terms of how we involved disabled people in the development of the communication assistance quality framework, we worked really closely with our 2 communication assistance providers, and they'd had first-hand experience of working with people with disabilities in courts. And Then we also consulted widely on the draft quality framework as it was in development, and we engaged with the stakeholders that we engaged with covered a wide range of government and non-government organisations with an interest in the needs of people with disabilities, and covered off physical, intellectual, sensory disabilities and neurodiversity within our consultation. So we made quite a few changes in response to the draft quality framework, in response to the feedback we had from the disabled community. Some of the things that we did, for example, were around better reflecting the needs of people with traumatic brain injury within the framework. We took a more stronger approach in recognising the human rights as the context for the service. We looked how to better integrate the service alongside mental health assessments, and also ensured that the whole way through the service looked to uphold the mana of participants as it was being delivered within the framework. I'm happy to answer the A and B.
I'm going to suggest we hold off on those, but just in a yes/no type answer.
Yeah.
Were disabled people themselves who use the services involved in the work you've just described?
Just only to the extent that they responded to our consultation, and that we had firsthand, when we worked with our communication assistants, we were very mindful of ensuring that the service development met their needs across the board, because they were the experts in that area.
Rightio. Thank you. I think that's clarified it. I'm going to suggest that the two subparts for that question be held off as potential supplementaries, and call us to take our break. It's time for us to let the public go and have a cup of tea while the IMM goes off and finalises those supplementary questions. Thank you all. See you in 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 3 p.m. We will begin in 60 seconds. Yeah, you're I'll just have to wait till we're done today to fix that.
And Francis.
Okay, we are back. Jonathan Godfrey speaking. I'm chair for the session, and it's time for the supplementary questions. We had a couple of overhang questions from part one, which we do want to put explicitly as the first two supplementary questions. Nathan Bond is going to be from Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Nathan is going to be the person who puts all of the questions in this session on behalf of the IMM. So Nathan, would you mind asking each of parts A and B from primary question 9? We'll start with part A, get an answer, and then go to part B. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. So 9 part A. How have you ensured that the framework has the flexibility to meet individual needs? For example, to include alongside the specified professions, communication support from people who know and understand the person well to ensure the best outcomes, while maintaining neutrality and independence assured through the framework. Did you want me to do both A and B?
I will just stick with A at the moment. Rajesh?
I might just hand directly over to Deb Mills
Thank
to
you.
answer that question.
Yep.
Deborah Mills speaking from Ministry of Justice. So in terms of the flexibility within the communication assistance quality framework, so I'd say that there really is quite significant flexibility to meet individuals' needs. And a communication assessment is done for each participant, and that usually takes around 2 to 3 hours to complete and results in a tailored report that gives the court specific advice around how to facilitate communication for that participant. And then there's no one-size-fits-all approach into the types of interventions that the court can provide to support that person. And a ground rules hearing is held before the court proceeding begins to ensure that everyone agrees on how communication will specifically be facilitated for that person. So the types of interventions that might be put into place include things like monitoring the participant's stress and maybe ensuring that they undertake frequent breaks, provide some visual or easy read aids to help with a person with their understanding, making sure all the questions in court are answered using plain English and are clearly broken down into single concepts if that's what's required. And also a communication assistant can monitor for any miscommunication in court and notify the judge if there is any miscommunication. So in terms of making sure whether we we did look at whether the people that know the participants should work alongside the trained independent communication assistants, and that came through in our consultation as well, and we had a good think about how that would work best. In the end, we decided that the decision was best to keep the role being an independent communication assistant with specialist training in that area. But we would make sure that and encourage the communication assistant to work alongside the participant and their whānau and support people to make sure that and gather the information around how the person communicates best, and where relevant, they could integrate those strategies that the person uses on a day-to-day basis to communicate into the recommendations for the court to ensure that their needs can be met.
Thank you. Nathan, if you can have part B, please.
Certainly. Part B, procedural accommodations in justice are not subject to budgetary restriction. Can you confirm that communication assistance is available in sufficient quantity to meet demand, and how has this been evaluated? Thank you.
Sure, so Deborah Mills again. The Ministry of Justice receives funding for communication assistance through one of its boats, and there's no cap within that appropriation for what we spend on communication assistance. So our costs have increased progressively over the last few years. In 2014-15, we spent around $15,000, and in the last financial year, that has increased up to $1.13 million. So we've increased the amount we've made available for the service year on year. In addition to those costs of the service, we also make funding available to support the two communication assistance providers to enable them to invest in training and expanding and developing a really high quality workforce that can meet the increasing demand for the service. And we monitor the demand for the service jointly with the providers to ensure that we have a workforce in place to meet the demand.
Can I just get those numbers again from you? Jonathan speaking. Current is north of $1.1 million.
That's right. Yeah, Deborah speaking. Yeah.
When was the $15,000?
In around the 2014-15 financial year.
So in 8 years, we've gone from 1 or 2 court cases to plenty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
My graphs where I have evaluated the funding, I'm going to hold my hand up to pretty much an exponential shape of a growth for the graph. So it pretty much goes straight up.
And there is no cap.
We've taken steps to ensure that the funding's available for the service. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very clear. We're going to move to questions that relate to the Human Rights Act now. Nathan, next one, please.
Okay. Supplementary question 2. Some disabled people experience discrimination because they are currently excluded from funded support based on their impairment types. For example, fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, or myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. How will governments work together with the new Ministry for Disabled People to actively engage these groups and ensure they are recognised under a social model of disability and are included in future policy frameworks? Thank you.
Who am I looking at, Rajesh? You?
I might start a little bit, and then maybe, I'm not sure, maybe look to Brian just generally about sort of some of where the Ministry of Disability, where the new ministry will be going. So this is more broadly, I think, at a Human Rights Act level, that's kind of one of the issues that we would potentially look at if we were going to look at that act more broadly. It's just that what are the grounds for discrimination, but that's more at that larger framework level. Some of the things you're referring to there are quite specific conditions or things that people suffer from, and how is it that people have access to those services. In terms of working across government, I think we've got a range of models now that help us in grappling with some of those things. A lot of the work that's been done in that mental health area and how we've come together as a collection of agencies is very important around that stuff. So as an example, with our family violence, sexual violence work, it's meant that 10 agencies have been able to grapple with the issues, and we can actually look at how it is that we can properly help people. And in the context of FASD, we're also looking at various programs about how do we accommodate that in the justice system as well. And then there's a range of things that we're working on with the Ministry of Health in that area too, to make sure that people get the help that they need. In terms of working with the new ministry, again, I think that just builds on, and that underpins why the new ministry was created, and builds on the new models that we have in the public service. So joint venture is one, whether it's under the new Public Service Act, you've got interdepartmental executive boards, which binds agencies together, but there's also been further evolutions in the way we work on interagencies projects together and combine our resources. But Brian, is there anything to add regarding the new ministry's approach at this stage that you're aware of?
Yeah, I'll comment, use the response, because we actually get quite a few emails about this in terms of the new ministry. One is we can't predict what the new ministry will do, but secondly, the question is around, will the new ministry have a broader definition of disability and who gets support? And the answer to that question is, we would hope the definition of disability is that which is defined in the UN CRPD and the New Zealand Disability Strategy. However, who gets access to support is needs-based, and we would hope not on diagnosis, medical diagnosis alone. So I think we would want to see a shift to more of a social model in terms of who gets support, and because diagnosis alone doesn't actually define the level of disability. So that's the answer to the question, Nathan. We would hope that much more access to services is based on the social model rather than medical diagnosis alone. And it's a question that will come out of the Y2575 claim too. The first week of hearings of that was 3 weeks ago, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was certainly the subject of that. And the Ministry of Health and Government will need to think really carefully about what comes out of that hearing. It traverses the same issues.
Thank you, Brian. Nathan, we'll move to the next supplementary, I think, please.
Okay, supplementary question 3. What steps are the government taking to address IMM recommendations on the inconsistency of current immigration policy with the CRPD? Thank you.
I might just briefly check if there's anybody who on the call. I mean, I don't have MB or immigration officials here with me, and I know that there's quite a lot of work being currently undertaken in advising the Minister of Immigration, who also happens to be the Minister of Justice, and I know that it occupies a great deal of his time at the moment. So that is a range of work underway, but I can't offer any particular comment on the nature of that at this stage, unless, Brian, you've got anything to add?
Yeah, all I can add is that that is the subject of a select committee hearing based on a petition that was brought to the government. So again, I don't know the outcome of that, Nathan, where that will head.
Which probably means we're going to the next supplementary, Nathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Supplementary question 4. What are government agencies doing to ensure that all public consultations are accessible for deaf and disabled people, not just consultation on disability-specific issues? Thanks.
Thank you. Raju speaking again. I suppose I touched a little bit on those types of things, and it wasn't so much on consultation, but there was the work we did around the referendums, and that was trying to make sure it was imparting all of the information. We've also looked at what we've done in the incitement consultation space as well, when we looked at making available a broad range of things. I might ask Anne. Is Anne on the call? I've lost my place. Whether Anne or...
Yes,
oh, there you are.
Go.
Yes, I might just pass over to Anne, who has some more first-hand knowledge and can comment on this in more detail. Thank you.
So one of the things is that we've already done quite a lot of work with various government agencies around consultation. We try and do as much as possible. Part of it is also the development of agencies around how they provide us the information for consultation so that it's useful to the disabled community in those various formats. And also getting government agencies to bring the information to us early. So we've had consultations on social cohesion, we've had consultations on family and sexual violence strategy and action plan, we've had it from the mental health wellbeing on their strategy and focus going forward. We've had it on high needs review. Just trying to think, but there's been a whole lot of increasingly consultation documents. You heard about the various referendum ones. They were one of the first off the rank, but we're increasingly seeing more and more government agencies coming. We're just doing one on working for families at the moment, a consultation around that. So increasingly, we're seeing government departments coming to us. We are encouraging them through our training to make sure they come early. I think we're also doing one on the health reform. We're doing a consultation document on the health reform that's just come to us this week. So probably on a weekly basis, we would get one or two. But as I said, we can only translate if we get some reasonable amount of time in which to do it. Brian, you got your hand up.
Yes, just Brian Coffey speaking, just to add to Anne's comment. I think this question is a good one because it's one that Anne and the alternate format team have to deal with, is that we would love to put everything into alternate format. We don't have the capacity to do that at the moment. So the agreement is we will prioritise to those consultations that are most likely to impact on disabled people. So a judgment has to be made in terms of prioritising what work is put into alternate formats and how much of the document. Is that right, Anne?
Yeah, so we don't do the whole document. What we do is we make sure we have a context, a summary. If people want to have more information, where to go to. Also, one of the things is education around having a variety of ways to actually provide information in alternate formats, and also points of contact. So making sure not only is it a phone number, but also having a text option or an email option, and they've been important in ensuring that the community is not excluded, and also having them in hard copies so that one of the things I think we always say, it's not enough to just do the alternate format is a mechanism for gaining information. How you disseminate it to the community is also critical. So you make sure, particularly where the community is digitally excluded, that you actually get to the people who you want to get to. But I think the other thing to make note of is that in an environment where there's significant COVID, and there's a significant change. So all of the documents, many of the documents we've produced up to now, because of the changes, have had to have a revamp this week. So that's meant that we've had to prioritise COVID stuff over other material. And that's a moving feast in terms of that prioritisation and going back and keeping everyone informed of how the priorities are moving. Brian, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Brian speaking. I was just going to add, again, it's interesting to reflect on these questions. If you go back to 2014, when we were first examined by the UN, what's going into alternate formats now is vastly different to what would have happened then. And just to comment that in 2021, the government put additional funding into alternate formats to build capability capacity, but government agencies are still funding and purchasing that service from within their own budgets. And I think, again, that's an important thing to be aware of.
Thank you.
Can I just, for clarity's sake, Brian, you used the word capacity on how much alternate format material can be made available. Where is the capacity problem?
So, and Anne might want to add to this, but at times agencies will say, we've got the money, we can pay for alternate formats, but we one of the issues is we just don't have, we need to build the capacity of providing that service. Anne, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think the capacity issue is really around the fact that we've got in 2 providers in terms of sign language. We've got 2 providers in terms of blindness formats, and we've got 1 provider in terms of easy read. But we need to make sure, and this is really important because I've heard people say we can provide it. It has to be quality. I'm not going to provide something that does not meet the quality, because that's an insult to disabled people. So it's got to be it takes a while to build up the skill. For example, making sure people
sorry, I think we've lost Anne a little bit.
Yes,
I have to write them and easy read. Now, I'm also looking at where it's late starting off with easy read into Te Reo, because we recognise that there are
Yeah, I think we're losing you, Anne. Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase Anne of what the snippets I heard, that there is a capacity issue because there aren't a wide range of providers who can provide a quality service to disabled people, and that there are new services coming online, in particular with efforts towards Te Reo and easy read in combination.
Yeah, and later on other formats.
Yes.
And Raj's got his hand up.
Rajesh?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add to that quality point, which was the comment I made regarding the referendums, but also some of the material provided around the court. I think we're probably quite demanding of the quality that comes through, more so than if you're a private enterprise advertising something, or giving some product information more generally. We've kind of been quite exacting of them. So I know when particularly with the referendums, they probably got quite sick of me kind of coming backwards and forwards to them, wanting assurances and testing done of how some of those things were coming across as well. So there's that part too. I think we probably take more of their time per paragraph translated or something, but it is that, it's quite an exacting task for them, and the capacity, I think, then gets stretched.
And I think that's really important, because it's to recognise it's a collaborative approach around making sure that the information, particularly where you're doing a translation and not a word for word, you're doing an interpretation, that it actually reflects the intent of the person providing us with the information.
Right.
Jonathan, I just wanted to, Brian speaking, I just wanted to make a final comment for a wider audience, and just a reminder that where organisations are doing translations into alternate formats, it doesn't necessarily mean that they believe the messages that the agency is giving them to translate, and there has been some confusion in the community about that. So this is a straight translation of what agencies have given, and the fact that People First or another organisation might be translating those documents doesn't mean that they necessarily believe in everything that's in that document.
Yes. Thank you, Brian. We are going to move to questions about equality before the law and supported decision making. Nathan, please.
As a follow-up to primary questions 8 and 9, what is being done to provide individualized contextual information and resources in alternative formats and meeting information needs for deaf and or disabled people prior to or when going through the justice system. Thank you.
Who am I looking towards, Rajesh?
If I might, it's Rajesh speaking. I wondered, Deb, if I can just get you to maybe traverse some of the things that we do regarding providing assistance to people when they enter the system and the assistance we can provide.
Sure, I can touch on a couple of things. Deborah Mills here, Ministry of Justice. One would be the use of sign language interpreters for court participants. So they're available, funded by the Ministry, for anyone who identifies the need to the court that they need a sign language interpreter. Again, there's no cap on the funding for that budget as well. We are also developing a quality framework for interpreters, which covers sign language interpreters as well, which will ensure that the high quality of sign language interpreter services are provided in the court. Some of the other things I could potentially touch on are within the young adult list. This is a court that's operating in a few parts of the country, mostly in Porirua, and it deals with young people aged 18 to 25 who may have neurodiversity, and we've developed a dyslexia-friendly font booklet to ensure that the person can understand who the participants are, who the people are in the court, and what their role is in the court. It's being evaluated and is looking quite promising. And we're developing, I touched on this earlier too, resources for children and care are going to be very much engaged with disabled people in their development to ensure that the resources we develop meet the needs of disabled children.
Thank you. Nathan, go to number 6, please.
Can you advise when the second phase of legal audit referred to by ODI will occur? Thank you.
So to clarify, this was the audit of legislation. Brian, you referred to it needing to be updated in some way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, because actually what you did make me do was reach for the list of legislation that was a concern. And actually, I'd welcome the opportunity to sit down with the DPO coalition, because much of that legislation has actually changed since we generated that list. So it's just a matter of making a time with the coalition to go through that.
So that can be put on your soon as list.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Not before the 29th of April.
Fair enough. We'll go to the next one then, Nathan. We've got a pretty definite answer for 6. So we'll go to question 7, shall we?
Yep. In the consultation on the repeal of the Mental Health Act, questions were asked such as, should compulsion be allowed and should seclusion be allowed? These practices are inconsistent with the convention. Why were those questions asked? Please explain how this contributes to the progressive realization of the convention. Thank you.
So Rajesh, I think we're heading straight to John Crawshaw.
I think so. Health colleagues, over to you.
John Crawshaw speaking. So we can't, when we're developing legislation and consulting, we actually have to make sure that we put all of the questions that are likely to end up as part of the finalisation of the policy around developing legislation. We certainly recognise that the disabled community does not wish or does not want seclusion and restraint. However, we also need to ask those questions about, in the context of, well, if we don't have that, what is necessary to keep people safe? And so it was actually necessary for us to firmly consult on that. And if you look at our discussion document, we made it quite clear that the view was that they are not therapeutic. But nevertheless, we were required, rather than just assume that we knew the answer, to actually formally consult.
There's unlikely to be, is it? Oh, no, I shouldn't assume. Is there anyone else going to contribute from government side, or has John covered that off for us?
I think that's probably enough on that point, but just generally, given that we do a lot of legislation, we do find ourselves putting questions to make sure that we do elicit a response, even if we might assume or guess what there might be. But it's about making sure we gather all the necessary information so that it informs the decision making.
Yes, I think the concern for the IMM in this instance is that by asking the question when you know that it's never going to go forward, because you will automatically be in contravention of the convention if it did go forward, seems odd. There's got to be a better way than asking, what do you think about it? But I suspect that that's food for thought rather than necessarily wanting an answer from you now. Does anyone want to reply? Or
He's got his hand up.
I'll try and respond.
Sorry, I wasn't going to reply to that.
Brian, we'll let John go first, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah.
So as I said, we really did need to make sure that we could actually elicit the full range of views. We're aware that in the space of mental health legislation, there is often quite divergent views as to what needs to be presented. If we don't cover all of the full range of options, then we could end up being criticised that we actually had not elicited the full range of options, not from the disabled community, but from some of the other community. So we actually need to put, as impartial public officials, the full range of views that are expressed around the question, including what does the convention say. So we are obliged to make sure that we have elicited the full range of views from the public. Otherwise, it will come up in select committee or other parts, and it is best that we actually uncover all of the issues before we actually present to the Minister the policy options.
Can I ask a supplementary for clarification then? If a significant proportion of respondents had come back and said, sure, it's okay to use seclusion, what would have happened?
We haven't completed, as I said in my earlier response, we've had the range of submissions analysed by an independent party so that we aren't accused of presenting a biased view. We have yet to see that, and if that did come back, we already know that the government's policy position is that the legislation needs to be as compliant with the human rights obligations as possible. And so we've put that into the mix.
Okay, I'm really glad I asked. I genuinely am. Brian, please.
Kia ora, Jonathan. I'm not responding to that question. I just want to respond to something on Slido, a statement, because I'm concerned that some statements are going there that aren't factual, and that we ought to respond to them.
Yeah. I might get you to hold that to the end.
Okay, thank you.
One of the reasons why we have a moderation process for the supplementary questions is so that we use the expertise of the IMM. I think that if a person posts on Slido that they have a very real concern, that might not be based on the best factual information, but it is based on their personal experiences and their perceptions. We have made a commitment as the IMM to sharing all of the feedback with officials from this forum. But we have a moderation process in order to make sure we do focus our discussions on fact. And I think, and unless we get serious time at the end, I'd like to go on with the supplementaries, and we'll deal with the perceptions afterwards. So can I move to the next supplementary? Nathan, if you can do that, and I'll make a note about the other stuff. Nathan.
Jonathan, supplementary question 8. In international human rights law, the government has obligations to respect, protect, fulfill the rights of disabled people. What actions has the government taken to educate and support third parties, such as medical practitioners, banks, or rest homes about legal capacity? And what actions has the government taken to ensure third parties are not limiting disabled people's right to exercise legal capacity by imposing substitute decision-making mechanisms such as guardianship or enduring power of attorney as a matter of course? Thank you.
I think we'll start with you, Rajesh.
Okay, somewhat of a broad-ranging question in terms of, I suppose, how businesses or other institutions, organisations in New Zealand deliver their services or provide services to people and how they accommodate people with disabilities. In terms of what the government does, I suppose it depends a little bit on a range of the different regulators or the different agencies that are responsible for different areas. In terms of starting with the Ministry of Justice, some of our things in terms of the enduring powers of attorney, things like that, we have the information around some of those things on our website, which is available to practitioners in this area or people who might be wanting to explore using some of those powers. All of that goes through a court process, and so part of supporting that is what I've mentioned previously, is we're working with the Law Society and the ongoing continuing legal education, making sure that they're up with all of the up to date with all of the practices there, and also in terms of how one deals with the clients and how the client care should be undertaken when you've got people with different needs. So that's one very small example. In terms of some of the things you referred to, like banking or other things, I don't have a lot of information to hand personally, but overarching to say that they're all subject to the law and the requirements of the law. And for some of the larger organisations, I do know that they are have their own units and approaches about what they do to make sure that they are compliant and deliver services in a way that meets their obligations towards disabled people under the law. Sort of more generally in that space, there is the work that the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment does, which is about guiding principles for people in business around their human rights obligations. So that's a general range of things that they do that covers the broad range of human rights issues. So it's something that's probably best addressed. It's hard for me to kind of provide an overarching government response, given that it's probably just about all of the agencies, but I might just refer to John Crawshaw at Health, who can probably provide some commentary around what they've been doing in the health context. So
as people know, that the current Mental Health Act is principally substitute decision-making legislation. However, when we revised the guidelines in 2020, we took a deliberate tact of actually providing an overview document that actually talked about human rights and the need to interpret the legislation both within the context of the Bill of Rights and also all of our human rights obligations. As part of that, we deliberately promoted substitute decision-making as well as advanced directives. While we can't write it out of the Act, we can actually promote and educate health practitioners about that, and have worked with one of our national workforce agencies to develop a training program to implement those new guidelines to ensure that they are educated in terms of not just that aspect, but also the new guidelines. So we have actually done our best to promote within the context of the confines of the current legislation.
Anyone else?
Juanita, your hand up.
But Juanita, are you coming in for this one?
Kia ora, Juanita Ryan. I head up health services for Arapaitama Corrections. And maybe just an opportunity really, we've got a lot of work to do in this, the area of strengthening how we support people with disabilities in a prison context. And I've spoken in a number of the forums over the last week, but just around our context and what we're doing within the health services in relation to informed consent for rehabilitation, for health services, for mental health addiction services, and support for people with disabilities. We've engaged a specialist to come in and provide a significant training package across the, starting with the senior leadership team for health services, but working to ensure that our health services staff are fully aware of their legal responsibilities to understand the needs, the limitations and the strengths of the individual in front of them, and are very clear about how to walk through, for example, the issues of informed consent, how their health and disability information may be used, and for us to have some very clear parameters operationally, policy settings, and also a significant training regime, if you like, across the health services to really uplift how our staff are thinking about the individual in front of them and the needs that they are presenting with. Particularly in our context, as I've referenced in this morning's forum, because we are a context where there is a risk of coercion if we are not very careful about how we're engaging with the human that we are responsible for serving within a corrections space.
Thank you. I think we'll move to question 9, please, Nathan.
What specific investment has the government made in building the capacity of disabled people to exercise their legal capacity and make decisions about when and how much support they may need to do so? And as a matter of urgency, how is this applied in the justice system to avoid the courts operating a binary system whereby people either have legal standing or have no legal standing, and a provision a continuum of support? Thank you.
I think that last bit's supposed to be provision of a continuum of support. Rajesh, we'll start with you and you can guide the traffic.
Okay. So I'm clear, it's about what investments have been made in terms of providing support for people through the court process.
No, not quite.
No.
What support is there for increasing the capacity of disabled people?
In the context of someone being able to participate.
Especially in the justice sector, yes. So to exercise their legal capacity.
Right.
So we might describe that as empowerment of the disabled person.
Okay. If we're in the context of the legal system, there are other things that we've touched on already, which is about providing accessible information and being able to provide communications assistance so you can participate effectively in what is happening. And then by doing that, then obviously you can make some clearer choices and instruct your counsel or participate yourself depending on the nature of the inquiry. Other aspects of that include legal aid is available, but again, there are limitations around the eligibility criteria, and those are general eligibility criteria for everybody. But if you are eligible, there are a range of supports that can be provided through that service in terms of your participating in the advice you can receive going through the legal system. And there's usually ongoing work regarding how we might be able to better improve that, and that's always the subject of budget decisions and is something considered through budgets, the wider government budget process. In terms of any other wider supports, I would have to defer to colleagues in terms of if they have any particular examples they can give about what supports that might be available. I'm not sure if Deborah, in the context of your work with the ministry, whether there's anything else that you might like to specifically add before I continue. Deborah?
Hello, I'm Deborah Mills here, Ministry of Justice. So the things I'm thinking that we could touch on are around training for legal professionals in this space and how they can engage better with participants who are have a disability. So there's been quite significant investment in training through the NZLS, the New Zealand Law Society, continuing legal education. We've run a range of forums and for the lawyers around questioning vulnerable participants and how to do that in a way that they can understand and respond better in court. And then next week, we're on the 13th of April, we're running a communication assistance forum specifically for legal professionals to help them understand the service better, and it's particularly when to engage it. So how to identify that a person, that a client that they're working with might have a disability or underdeveloped language and communication needs, so that they'll know when they can when they should engage that service, and then how they should work alongside a communication assistant when they do engage it. Some of the other work we've done in that space is to get some feedback from legal professionals, including judges, around how the communication assistant service has benefited them. And actually, we've found that a lot of those professionals found that the communication assistant had increased their ability to recognise other clients, other people in court with a communication difficulty, and also that they have improved their own understanding of how to work with people with disabilities and communication disabilities over time. So having that service available is beneficial for the participant, but it's also having a wider impact of teaching and raising awareness within the justice system to ensure that they will meet other participants' needs will be better met in future.
Thank you. Can I suggest, Nathan, we're going to run out of time, and in order to make sure we cover off the other broader topic, that we jump into questions 11 to 14. And so if you can take us to 11 and then 13, and then we'll come back if we have time to the other ones.
Okay.
So 11, please.
Question 11. What actions has the government taken to expand resources for accessible, free or low-cost legal advisory / advocacy services, specifically for disabled people, to facilitate equitable national access to justice? Thank you.
Raju speaking. So largely the way that the government provides legal advice or legal services to people generally is through largely the legal aid system, and legal aid is available for criminal legal aid, family legal aid and civil legal aid, but as I've noted, there's quite a limited eligibility criteria around civil legal aid and family legal aid. The other aspects of how we support that is through community law centres, and so over the last few years there has been further investment in community law centres to be able to provide greater services to people generally, but also just checking my notes here in the context of community law centres, we've provided funding to the Auckland Disability Law Service as well. So that's one particular example as well. And community law is a more broader ranging provider of services at that front level to help people through the issues they've got in a broad range of areas. So that is the current system and where the investment is, and those are areas we're continuing to work on and look at. And as I touched on in some of the primary answers as well, we're currently doing that work about wayfinding for access to justice, and also the legal needs survey, which is really about trying to get some more concrete data about unmet legal need. And that'll be the basis for which we can carry on looking at what further support we can provide to people in the future.
Thank you. Supplementary question 12 is one that we are going to ask for the record, but we're expecting a response in writing, not a response right now. So Nathan, would you like to read that one for the record?
Yep. Okay. In response to the question about overrepresentation in justice system, we heard about initiatives in the courts, but little about specifically cross-government actions to reduce disabled people's exposure to risk factors such as disengagement from education. Can you please undertake to provide a written response about cross-government actions?
So we're looking for the reduction, prevention, etc. of disabled people being in the justice system at all. You addressed what happens once they're in there. So there's, all we're asking for is an undertaking for you to address that question in writing, and we don't know who it is that we ought to be leaning on for an answer. So between Rajesh and Brian, can we have that commitment?
Yeah, ODI will coordinate that, Jonathan. It might take a little bit longer for that one than the 29th of April in terms of working across agencies, but we'll work hard to get that for you.
Thank you. That's what we needed right now. Nathan, question 13, please. It's going to have to be the last one, I think, team.
What actions is the government taking to ensure educators, police and lawyers are trained to understand diversity and do not perpetuate the criminalisation of disabled people through interpreting behaviours as disruptive, disobedient, non-compliant or dangerous? Thank you.
Rajesh, you don't have to answer for the educators.
No, I think that's, I'm wondering whether aspects of that question will be picked up as we do the coordinated response on the previous question as well, more broadly about what's being done, particularly, I suppose, in that youth justice space as well, where it's that I know from past experience working in the collaborative youth justice area, along with Oranga Tamariki education, social development and others, that there is that wider view about what can we do to help people come out of it, but not actually accidentally, I suppose, or by not being fully aware of the circumstances, push people towards it. So there's probably something we can touch on in that area. In terms of broader comments, for police, and I don't really want to speak too much of them, and this is from my knowledge again doing the cross-sectoral work, they do have a range of programs underway at the high level, which are sponsored by the current commissioner, who's come in those programs around sort of high level, you'd call them policing excellence, and what they also call reframe, which is very much about them looking at how they exercise their discretion and how they go about approaching policing. And you would have also heard the commissioner talking about policing by consent and things like that too. So there's that aspect of it broadly in terms of the whole constabulary about how they come to some of those, how they come to situation. That's not just disabled peoples, but also the wide variety of people that they face in the community as well. So that is very much a focus for them about how they do that. And if you think about it, the exercise of discretion by police is actually one of the most powerful and useful things that enables them to be able to respond to the situations in front of them. But alternatively, discretion can also be the greatest danger, and that if it's not exercised appropriately or properly, it can lead to negative outcomes, or if it's based on things like bias or prejudice and other things like that. So that's very much in the minds of police in terms of how they go about doing that work, and they're very much focused on it. So that's that. And then the other aspect of that is in terms of police prosecutors and the Crown, which have the responsibility of finalising and bringing the cases to court as well. They are also doing ongoing education and making sure that they're fully aware of the circumstances of the case as it goes through. And that sort of sits in that wider context I talked about in terms of Te Ao Marama and how it is that we're looking more at the person rather than simply at disposing of a case, which is the way that we always want it to be. So that's kind of, I hope gives you just a little bit of an outline about how that's been progressed. And we've also referred previously to what we do in collaboration with the New Zealand Law Society in terms of making sure that their ongoing continuing education builds on the latest thinking in this area and getting those people consistently through that training and refreshing them and reinforcing issues. But I might see Brian has his microphone live, and whether there was something you wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
Also wondering if we want to hear from Oranga Tamariki.
Yeah. Yeah. So Brian speaking. Briefly, maybe the question for education is deferred to tomorrow as a supplementary. I think they will talk about the guidance that they're developing around physical restraint and the understanding that behaviour is often a communication issue, not necessarily a issue that needs correction, if you like. And then the other point that I would make is that New Zealand Police has got a position at headquarters that is focused on the disability community to lift that awareness within the police.
Thanks, Brian. Oranga Tamariki, can you give us anything in 1 to 2 minutes?
I can give you something much shorter. We definitely want to be included in the response back to you about prevention measures, and in particular our efforts to improve and increase our capability around in our social workers, in particular in frontline, in understanding disability and particularly different neurodiversities that manifest as behavioural issues. So we're really, working to try to lift that.
Thank you. And that was Claudia from
Yes,
Oranga
thank you.
Tamariki.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. You haven't spoken for a while, so I just had to jog people's memory. Look, people, I'm running out of time. Brian, have we covered off the dealing with the Slido issue you wanted to raise? Can we take that offline and maybe worry about it tomorrow, or do you want to deal with it now? You're on mute, or I'm not hearing you.
You're on mute, Brian.
Yep, done. Just the issue that the Royal Commission had shortened its processes. Our understanding is that hasn't happened at all. So just wanted to be clear on that.
Right. Okay. So if that person still has a concern, they should contact
the Royal Commission.
There we go. I'm going to thank you all for your time this afternoon, and bring back Ron Baker to close today's proceedings for us. Ron, I'm not hearing you yet.
Is that better?
That's much better, dude. Thank you. There we go.
Yours, Jonathan.
Yours.
Nā mihi kia tātou katoa, e te iwi, huri noa. Koutou e matakitaki mai anu, i nei ki roto tēnei kaupapa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou. Ka tira, greetings everybody for this wonderful afternoon's deliberations. Kei te mihinu kia tātou katoa. At the end of our time, kei te huri anō tō tātou nei whakaaro, kei runga aka ki te wahingaro. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. E tō mātou matuitarangi, Almighty Heavenly Father. Kei te tau anō huki mātou nei o pono nā kei muatu araro. Ina te ki a koe, hei whakapiri mai nei kia mātou. We, your humble servants, come before thy grace and ask thy presence to be with us. Nō reira te matua, whakapiri mai. Mana ki tia mai mātou, e tako te hio kine e nei kaupapa nui I waini tātou. And we ask that bless these deliberations and all of these kaupapa we have laid amongst us. Mana ki tia. Hapai te ene kia whakanui anō ki nei tātou te iwi mo tō tātou nei haere ke runga tamato te whenua. And I ask that in these blessings that will uplift us to be able to deliberate and carry these things forward more for the health of all of us and for the strength and for the wellness of us all who live in this place, Aotearoa. Nō reira, mana ki tia mai, mana ki tia mai, mana ki tia mai. Nō reira te matua, Ka tau mai hui nei te mutunga o tēnei tō tātenei hui. As we come to the end of our deliberations, kei te ina te kia koe, kia whakatau o manakitanga ki nungia matu katoa. We ask thy blessings be with us again. E whakakapi mai tēnei tō tātenei kaupapa kei rungo hoki, te ingoa tapu tō tātou kai whakaora, hu krai te ake, ake. Amen. And we give thanks and we close our time together on as many blessings. Nō reira, huri no, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Kia ora koutou, Jonathan. Ngā mihi.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, everyone. Until 9 in the morning. Good afternoon.